By the early months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's intelligence officers had grown so accustomed to hearing exaggerated claims about supposed Allied innovations that they dismissed most reports before even reading them, particularly those suggesting the British had somehow developed fighter aircraft capable of launching rockets with enough force to sink destroyers or pulverize hardened concrete bunkers. To seasoned German analysts, who remembered the limited usefulness of rocket projectiles in the First World War and had observed the disappointing results of Soviet Katyusha barrages, such stories seemed not only improbable but technically absurd. They pointed out in briefing rooms across northern France that mounting unguided rockets on single-engine fighters defied aerodynamics, physics, and common sense. How, they argued, could any pilot possibly maintain accuracy while simultaneously managing the recoil and imbalance created by firing 8 rockets at once? These reports were filed alongside what the Wehrmacht believed to be typical Allied propaganda. Wild claims crafted to boost morale rather than reflect battlefield reality. Confident in the strength of their panzer divisions, their coastal fortifications, and their meticulously reinforced strongpoints, Germany's military planners saw little threat in anything short of massed heavy bomber raids. But that confidence collapsed spectacularly on the morning of March 18, 1944, when Hawker Typhoon fighters from No. 609 Squadron swept low over a German convoy near Abbeville and unleashed a weapon system the Germans had mocked only weeks earlier. The rocket's 60-pound warhead struck with such violent precision that trucks vaporized in the middle of the road, leaving survivors stumbling from burning wreckage in stunned confusion, unable to understand how vehicles could be torn apart without a single bomb crater marking the tarmac. These were clean penetrations. Fuel tanks erupted, ammunition stowed in the convoy detonated in cascading secondary explosions, and entire columns dissolved into fire. Wehrmacht after-action reports filed that same week read like the notes of men struggling to categorize something they had not been trained to expect. Some commanders assumed the British were using new aircraft-mounted anti-tank guns, perhaps a modified 2-pounder cannon, because the results seemed too precise for anything else. The truth was far more unsettling. The RAF had fielded the rocket projectile Mark III, an unassuming but devastatingly effective weapon that would redefine ground attack aviation before 1944 ended. German skepticism had not been irrational. Their technical staff raised valid concerns born from their own failed experiments. In 1942, the Luftwaffe had tested rocket armament on the Focke-Wulf 190 using RZ 65mm rockets, only to discover accuracy collapsed beyond 300 meters and the additional weight ruined the fighter's agility. Engineers concluded rockets were better suited to desperation than doctrine, and because the British already had Spitfires and Mustangs, fighters equal or superior to anything the Germans fielded at low altitude, German analysts assumed Britain would never choose to burden such aircraft with crude, unguided ordnance. This fundamental misreading cost the Wehrmacht dearly. While German intelligence dismissed British rocket development as yet another Anglo-American bluff, RAF squadrons were refining their tactics into something approaching a lethal science. The brilliance of the system lay not in precision but in volume. A single Typhoon could carry 8 rockets, each delivering the explosive equivalent of a naval gun shell. A flight of 4 aircraft could strike with the intensity of a heavy cruiser's broadside. Hardened coastal batteries that had resisted months of strategic bombing crumbled when penetrator warheads punched through several feet of concrete before exploding inside. Bunkers designed to survive 500-pound bombs detonated from the inside when rockets found their air vents or firing slits. In addition to the physical destruction came a psychological terror unlike anything German troops had yet experienced. Air raids from bombers followed a predictable sequence. Distant engines, a rising whine, falling bombs, then impact. Rockets erased that pattern entirely. Typhoons approached low and fast, the shriek of their Napier Sabre engines masking the launch until a sudden ripping sound, described by survivors as fabric tearing magnified thousands of times, preceded instantaneous detonation. Entire infantry companies abandoned otherwise defensible positions after witnessing a single rocket strike. morale reports from 7th Army headquarters in April 1944 repeatedly mentioned rocket panic spreading among frontline units. The weapon the Luftwaffe had mocked as a fantasy was now shaping German tactical planning across occupied Europe. The rocket projectile Mark III itself represented the culmination of 18 months of accelerated British development prompted by a glaring tactical problem. By mid-1942, RAF planners recognized that conventional aircraft armament, machine guns and 20mm cannon, lacked the destructive power needed against modern armor and hardened fortifications. Bombing accuracy at low altitude remained inconsistent, and delayed fuse bombs often buried themselves harmlessly in soft soil. The Royal Navy had already adopted ship-launched rockets for anti-submarine warfare, proving the core concept was viable. British ordnance engineers combined simplicity with brutal effectiveness. A 60-pound assembly made of a 25-pound armor-piercing warhead attached to a 3-inch solid-fuel motor. Borrowing from anti-tank shell design, the warhead used a hardened steel nose capable of penetrating up to 14 inches of concrete or 5 inches of armor plate, after which an 11-pound Amatol charge detonated via a base fuse calibrated to explode only after the projectile had bored into its target. The result was catastrophic pressure buildup inside bunkers and vehicles, turning them into fragmentation chambers. Propulsion came from 19 pounds of cordite that burned for just over 1.5 seconds, accelerating the projectile to 1,500 feet per second over a distance of 400 yards. Stabilizing fins on the tail prevented tumbling, and the motor casing itself functioned as structural airframe. Cordite meant the rocket required only an electrical igniter, not pumps, valves, or fragile fuel tanks, making it cheap, safe to store, and easy for ground crews to reload. A full Typhoon armament of 8 rockets could be fitted in under 20 minutes. Launch rails bolted beneath each wing, angled slightly downward to match attack dive geometry, held rockets in place with spring-loaded clips. Pilots could fire individually, in pairs, or in a full ripple. Most chose the full 8-rocket salvo, which dispersed into a shotgun-like pattern roughly 30 yards wide at typical combat ranges. Accuracy was dependent on mastering dive profiles. The optimal attack involved beginning from 4,000 feet, accelerating to 350 miles per hour, and firing between 1,200–800 feet to balance precision with survivability. Crosswinds, temperature, humidity, and even small control inputs could cause drift, meaning pilots learned to read atmospheric conditions instinctively, skills no instrument could teach. British factories churned out more than 50,000 rockets per month by late 1943, enough to supply 26 Typhoon squadrons for the Normandy invasion, and each rocket cost only 12 pounds, an extraordinary ratio of cost to battlefield impact. The Typhoon itself had begun life as a troubled design. Intended as a high-altitude interceptor capable of catching the Focke-Wulf 190, its enormous 24-cylinder Napier Sabre engine promised spectacular performance but delivered reliability problems so severe that many pilots refused to fly early models. Tail structures failed under high-speed dives, cooling systems malfunctioned, and cylinder sleeves cracked under stress. By spring 1943, Fighter Command considered scrapping the program altogether. Yet an accidental discovery changed everything. During low-level trials, pilots realized the Typhoon's flaws at altitude became strengths near the ground. The thick wing that dragged at high altitude produced exceptional stability during strafing. The enormous engine generated brutal acceleration, and the sturdy airframe could absorb shocking amounts of battle damage. Aircraft returned with gunshot cylinders, shredded control surfaces, and flak holes that would have destroyed a Spitfire. Recognizing its potential, Fighter Command quietly repurposed the Typhoon into Britain's premier ground attack aircraft. Rocket rails required structural reinforcement, adding 600 pounds of weight and reducing top speed slightly, but the Typhoon still outperformed German fighters below 10,000 feet. Modification centers converted 30 aircraft per week by 1944. Training rocket-armed Typhoon pilots proved far more demanding than teaching conventional fighter combat. At the armament practice camp at Fairwood Common, pilots spent weeks drilling dive angles, target identification, and wind compensation. Live-fire exercises consumed thousands of rockets, and early student errors were deadly. If a pilot corrected course during firing, even by a fraction, the entire salvo scattered. The best pilots learned to trim the aircraft perfectly and remain absolutely still during the half-second launch. Others never mastered the skill and were reassigned. By early 1944, doctrine had coalesced around the 1,200-foot release altitude for combat missions. Squadrons adopted the cab rank system. Flights orbited above battlefields waiting for forward air controllers embedded with ground units to call them onto targets, creating a level of air-ground integration unprecedented at the time. The Typhoon's most famous baptism of fire came during the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, when German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army attempted to escape a tightening Allied encirclement. Columns stretched 15 miles, jammed with tanks, half-tracks, horse-drawn artillery, and fleeing troops. Luftwaffe presence had collapsed, leaving the sky to Allied aircraft. Wing Commander Charles Green realized conventional 4-aircraft attacks would be too slow. By the time they destroyed even a fraction of the column, nightfall would allow the Germans to escape. Instead, he ordered massed squadron strikes. At 2 p.m. on August 13, 16 Typhoons dove almost simultaneously, firing 128 rockets in 20 seconds. The result was apocalyptic. Ammunition trucks exploded, blocking the road. Vehicles rammed one another in panic. Smoke and heat rose in a column visible 12 miles away. Pilots made multiple passes through choking smoke. One Panther tank was struck by 3 rockets, rolled forward 30 yards, then exploded so violently that its turret catapulted into the air. Aircraft returned with wings punctured by shrapnel from their own rockets. German survivors described the attack as annihilation made mechanical. Hauptmann Ernst von Luck, commanding elements of the 21st Panzer Division, recorded that his Tigers, nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons, proved helpless against rockets plunging from above. One pierced his own command tank's engine deck, igniting fuel and ammunition. He escaped seconds before the turret blew free from the hull. The pocket remained a killing ground for days. Typhoon squadrons flew 6 sorties daily, refueling in minutes, rearming in 20, and returning to unleash further devastation. By the time Allied ground units advanced, they found more than 10,000 destroyed vehicles and tens of thousands of dead, a scale of destruction unmatched in the Western Front. Typhoons again proved decisive during Operation Plunder in March 1945, the Allied crossing of the Rhine. The Germans had fortified the eastern bank with more than 300 anti-aircraft positions. Heavy bombers risked destroying the very ground on which pontoons and assault boats would land. Only rocket-armed fighters could strike with precision without obliterating the riverbank. 16 Typhoon squadrons undertook systematic suppression. Each flak site was assigned individualized attack instructions. Pilots flew at dangerously low altitudes to maintain radio contact with forward controllers. Rockets penetrated firing slits and ventilation shafts of concrete bunkers, killing entire crews. By the time Montgomery's troops crossed the Rhine, more than 2/3 of German flak positions had been destroyed or abandoned. Losses to Typhoon units were severe, but acceptable given the scale of the operation. Pilots such as Robert Cole and Dennis Armitage died during these missions, victims of low-altitude flak fire that gave little room for recovery, yet their efforts ensured Allied crossing casualties remained far below forecasts. Debates within the RAF erupted over rocket accuracy. Operational Research Section analysts calculated that rockets hit a tank-sized target only about 5% of the time, horrifying commanders trained in traditional marksmanship doctrine. Air Vice Marshal Harry Broadhurst demanded explanations. Why commit such resources to a weapon that missed 95 times out of 100? Wing Commander Charles Green provided the answer. Unlike bullets, near misses mattered. A rocket landing 10 feet away could break track links, damage optics, wound crews, or ignite external fuel. Moreover, the psychological effect overshadowed the physical. German tank crews often abandoned functional vehicles after witnessing rocket strikes on others. The randomness of survival eroded discipline. Logistics disruption proved even more devastating. Destroying a single truck in a long convoy could stop the entire column. Rocket salvos required a single pass. Cannon attacks required several, increasing exposure. Industrial targets felt these effects profoundly. One marshalling yard struck by Typhoons in March 1945 remained unusable for 6 weeks despite only 4 direct hits on primary targets. The rest were near misses whose combined blast warped rails, severed cables, and terrified workers into abandoning the site. Typhoon operations transformed RAF doctrine. Before the war, the RAF saw itself primarily as a defensive fighter force and a strategic bombing arm. Close air support was considered a secondary, even undesirable mission. But the cab rank system introduced during Normandy revolutionized air-ground integration. Forward air controllers with VHF radios guided pilots with real-time instructions, describing targets using landmarks visible from above. This system bypassed the slow bureaucratic chain that once paralyzed air support. Risk of friendly fire remained real. One tragic incident on August 7 saw Typhoons mistakenly strike Polish armored units near Cannes. Afterward procedures were tightened, requiring verbal target confirmations and improved ground markings. Still, the system became the foundation of modern close air support doctrine and influenced NATO procedures for decades. Training Typhoon pilots remained grueling. Converting fighter pilots to rocket specialists required 12 additional weeks of low-altitude navigation, vehicle recognition, emergency procedures, and hundreds of practice rockets. Training accidents were frequent. David Johnson's memoir recounts that 3 of his 16 classmates died before completion. Combat attrition was worse. In August 1944 alone, 131 Typhoons were destroyed and 94 pilots killed, 15% of total strength in a single month. New pilots often survived only 11 sorties. Squadrons stopped learning names until men survived a week. Yet some pilots excelled. Roland Beaumont, later a famed test pilot, destroyed 63 German vehicles in 4 months, often flying lower than doctrine recommended. His aircraft returned damaged from 32 missions. Missed rockets kill no Germans, he explained when asked about his methods. The legacy of Typhoon rocket operations extends far beyond the Second World War. Modern attack helicopters and ground attack jets still rely on the salvo principle the Typhoon pioneered. The Apache's 16 Hellfire missiles mirror the Typhoon's 8 rockets in doctrine if not technology. Post-war aircraft from Korea to Vietnam carried unguided rockets that replicated RAF tactics. Even with the arrival of precision-guided munitions, pilots fire ripples of missiles to overwhelm defenses or account for failures. The cab rank concept evolved into modern forward air controller systems, including laser designation and satellite coordination. Yet despite advances, fratricide rates in modern conflicts remained comparable to Normandy, proving that no technology fully solves the chaos of identifying friend from foe in close air support environments. The psychological effects of rocket attacks also persisted. Iraqi and Taliban fighters fled at the sound of incoming aircraft much as German troops once did. In the end, the RAF entered the war believing strategic bombing would break nations and that fighter combat alone would decide air superiority. But the Typhoon and its rockets revealed a deeper truth. Wars are often won not by distant factories bombed from altitude nor by duels between interceptors, but by tactical air power integrated directly with ground forces, delivering immediate, decisive consequences. The Luftwaffe may have mocked British rockets in early 1944, but by the war's end those same weapons had helped reshape the fundamental principles of modern air-ground warfare, principles that continue to govern military operations around the world.